You see that slide? Can you see?
Yes.
That? Okay, good. Let me just, okay, thanks. So thanks very much for having me join your special Velvet Rope group. And I'm going to talk to you briefly about the WorkflowHub. And this is a computational workflow registry that comes out of a very large activity that Hervé and I involved in Europe. So the observation is that computational workflows are a big deal in data-intensive biosciences, which is where Hervé and I really work a lot. And here's a kind of collection of various different pictures of different workflow systems and different problems that they're solving in the biosciences area. And of course, computational workflows are really a special kind of software, a special kind of software which has a precise description and then a set of workflow management systems and supporting services in order to be able to orchestrate and execute that description across various different infrastructures. In a very large project called the European Open Science Cloud Life project, we're building a data and method commons, which basically uses these computational workflows as entry points to tools and data sets there, and has to work in a whole range of heterogeneous different systems. We know that there's currently over 300 different workflow management systems in the community, various different communities and different domains, from structural bioinformatics right through to translational medicine, and operating over federated infrastructures and collaborations. And for that, we really kind of need a tools registry, which I know you all know about, the bio.tools registry, and a workflow registry, but we didn't have a workflow registry able to do this, to execute this FAIR aspect where we could find and access workflows. So we have devised the Workflow Hub. The Workflow Hub is a workflow registry that takes any kind of system, so it's agnostic. It currently has 10 different kinds right now, including random scripts like Python scripts, but also Jupyter notebooks. These workflows can remain in their home repositories because folks are already using their home repositories, usually based on GitHub. We can link them with data and documents and into collections. They can be published with DOIs, and we have some discussions going on with publishers right now. And actually, it turns out we're now having workflows other than bioscience. So we have a whole bunch of workflows in from the climate community, for example. So the Workflow Hub interoperates with other systems, which I'll be showing you shortly, through various different standards. It has really pioneered some developments around metadata standards of how you describe workflows, and it has GitHub integration. It's really driven around the notion of metadata. So metadata is very important to the Workflow Hub, which means we've had to work with all different workflow management systems in order to be able to lift that metadata from them and couple to the execution platforms of those different workflow management systems. It was launched in September 2020, particularly to support COVID activities. So what can you register? Hell, you can register workflows. And presentations and publications and data sets, like example data sets to associate with the workflow. We currently have 202 workflows, highly curated workflows there, which 40 are COVID ones. And so here's a kind of example of a page of a workflow. So you can link to other workflows. You have authors and credit, there's licensing information, analytics, tagging. It handles versioning and handles mechanisms for doing search and so on. We couple it to execution platforms using the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health APIs. So here's a picture of Galaxy workflow, which is actually a COVID one. And when you go to that workflow, you can run it on the European Galaxy service. So you can click onto that workflow and get going right away onto the Galaxy service, and vice versa. You can search for that workflow over the Workflow Hub from the European Galaxy service. But we have other services like the Sapporo system in Japan, where you can do something similar. So if you find a workflow, you can view it on GitHub, you can request contacts, you can download it as an object. I'll get to that in a minute. You can run it if it's an appropriate place to run it, you can visit the source. You can also organize workflows based on tags and collections, but also in teams. So we support groups working together on workflows. We currently have 84 teams, 249 people profiles, and 77 organizations there. And we include things like submitter and author credit, workflow lifecycle support, bridges to users through channels, but also access permissions in teams, so you can keep your workflows private. And maybe never even share them, just share them amongst your enclave or while you're currently cooking them, as it were. We have multiple ways to register, from uploading from your computer or to linking to existing files on the web, or from importing from Git repositories, or through an object upload. And I'll mention that a little bit further on. And we have quite a lot of mechanisms for parsing metadata from these different repositories, particularly the Git repositories and resources, including special support for very high profile curated repositories, for example, like the Galaxy workflow system and their repositories. So this gives you a sort of an image of trying to import a workflow from a system. So this Workflow Hub is part of a bigger tools ecosystem that we're developed in this very large European project, which has 13 different research infrastructures, which translates to about 300 organizations in it. And so the Workflow Hub is partnering up with bio.tools and biocontainers, two other registries for tools and containers, all these different kind of repos, all these different kind of workflow management systems, but also dedicated services like testing and monitoring services. And how does it do this? Well, we developed this to have a metadata framework, because metadata has to circulate between all of these different services. And so the Workflow Hub takes in this metadata and it exports this metadata. And its metadata forms is really formed around these 5 different pillars, as it were: a system neutral workflow description, which is using common workflow language, although we support all the native languages as well, a ontology for inputs and output types, metadata markup about the workflow tools and parameters, where we use schema.org, and we have profiles developed in something called bioschema.org for how to describe a workflow and how to describe the parameters. We use the GA4GH APIs for being able to move flow data between these different or these objects through these different services. And we also package the workflows in something called a RO crate. An RO crate is a research object crate, which is a fair digital object. And that allows us to package together all the different components of the workflows with its companions, like its data and its provenance and other things, so that we can move it around all of these different services, and including exporting it to things like Zenodo and Dataverse and things like this. So this creates sort of fair digital objects. We support workflow lifecycle support within this tools ecosystem for curation and for sustainability. And so, downloading workflows, forking them, executing and testing them, and so on. The sustainability of workflows is particularly important. We need to make sure that they still work. So we had in that previous slide here, at least 2 different services that we use in order to test and monitor the workflows to make sure, are they still working? Because we need to do periodic execution of the workflows, and we're looking at ways of doing semi-automated maintenance of the workflows through machine actionable ways to look at changes to the workflows to see what has altered, and therefore how can they be updated in order to still execute. The whole thing is built by a community. We built it entirely virtually, this environment, because we started it during lockdown, actually. We have quite a big community of people who regularly contribute. So we have about 50 or so folks there, but we have 25 regulars who show up to these kinds of calls that we're having right now. We have folks who champion particular workflow management systems that we're doing specialized support for. Is very much built around a collaborative open development approach. This logo cloud, logos of partners, for example, the Australian Biocommons has adopted the system. We manage the specimen data refinery workflows for a biodiversity project called DISCO. We manage workflows for a project called IBISBA, which does industrial biotechnology. So we're doing quite a few things beyond omics now. And we're also doing work on what does it mean to be a fair computational workflow? So because we consider ourselves to be a fair workflow registry, and that's why we spent all our time on this metadata work. And for that, we have also linked up with this new Workflows Community Initiative, where I'll be leading the Fair Computational Workflows workstream. And that's it. So that was a bit fast, but I only had 8 minutes. So I hope that gave you some idea about what we did and do. Did that help?
That is awesome, Carole. Thank you so much.
And we, because we are supported and sponsored by this big European activity, we've got quite a good sustainability route too, which I ought to mention. Peter.
Yes, question. So I'm in my software development, workflows are just in the way because they do things that I use in the Unix terminal and various things. So not so familiar with all of your concepts. Can you go back to your first or second slide? I had a sort of a meta question about that. You had a little cloud and there were tools in it, and that with arrows.
Yeah, let me just go back to that. Oh, hang on. And show this one. Yeah.
If we see it, I can acknowledge.
Oh, okay. Am I not sharing now? Let me just share screen.
One of these days, I'll learn how to use workflows and Slurm and all of that crap.
Do you see it now?
Yes, but I think it's the slide before this one. Yeah, that one. That one.
Okay,
yes.
got it.
So in that cloud, you have all these tool, and tool goes to tool. So the arrow is probably data.
Yes.
And so if I think about a make file, the picture is reversed, because in a make file, the centric parts, the dependencies, are the data. You create data based on a target is not visible. Does that make sense, that language that I'm using, the make file?
Yeah, of course.
So it's reversed. So in workflows, I was part of one at some point. We had this discussion of doing it centric to the data or centric to the tools. And I was a big proponent of data-centric because I like make files. But in my team, they argued that a tool-centric should be common. And I asked this question to the guy who uses Pegasus, which is a tool builder. I think that JPL or Caltech is using. And he gave me a nondescript answer to the question of should we use this or the other. He says, you can use anything. So I lost my argument there. But what is your opinion about, are they indeed common? Do you have tool-centric and data-centric workflows?
No, I know exactly what you mean. Yes, you do. So there's, as I said briefly as I went past on my slides, there's about, I don't know, something like 310 different workflow management systems, Peter.
Oh,
and
boy.
they
behind.
all work radically differently. So I would say about 30 of them are really used beyond the team that actually invented the workflow management system. So they're the ones that really get adopted, and they are quite different. So Galaxy, which I mentioned, that's really actually a web application that has a very straightforward way of chaining together tools. But it's very, very popular because it's got all the applications in it, right? Something like Nextflow is almost like a Turing complete language, which is, and you actually don't really know the flow that you did until you run it.
Mhm.
So which makes describing it so that there isn't actually a way of doing a CWL description of Nextflow right now. Hervé, I know, is trying to work on something at the moment like that. SnakeMake is like Makefiles, but for Python. And
Oh,
so
that one I happen to know. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So SnakeMake is one of the workflow systems that is in WorkflowHub. So there's all different kinds of workflow systems. We, as WorkflowHub, we're agnostic. What we're interested in is, do you have some metadata about the workflow that tells me something about it? And we'll register it, but we won't execute it. We don't execute it ourselves. We link to an execution environment, or you download it, or you go to where you can execute it. So we try to be at the next level up, if you will. That just describes it. So this is what it does. But you're right. There are many different kinds of workflow management system. If you look at Kepler has multiple different execution semantics, depending on how you actually configure it and use its directors. So it's,
now, is my description of tool-centric or data-centric actually part of, it's either this or the other, or are there hybrid?
There's hybrids.
Methods? Yeah.
There's hybrids as well. There's every kind of mix you could manage.
I see.
Really. Yeah. If you want a lively discussion about this, Dan Katz is your man.
Oh, I know Dan very well.
because he has the same sort of view, which is really kind of a programming view versus a data flow type view, as it were. So
what would you say is his viewpoint, or he likes the controversy?
He's a tool programming view person rather than a data flow view person, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah, but then he comes from the functional programming world, and he does this funcx and parcel system, which is basically lambda calculus on steroids. So everybody has different approaches. In the registry, we attempt to be as agnostic as we can be. And we're interested in metadata that just said, what are you trying to do with this workflow? What are its inputs and outputs? And where can I find it effectively? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
That's okay. Well, I hope it clarified.
Yeah, it does. It's I don't have any extra ammunition, but
Anna.
Hi, yes, this was a great presentation, and we at Harvard Data Commons, we also talk about workflows and incorporating workflows in Harvard Data Commons. So I would actually really like to pick your brain, and I have many questions, but maybe I can just also start with a few. So maybe what would you say is the biggest difference between a workflow registry and data repository?
A data repository? Oh, that's very interesting. So I've got another talk on that I'll send you, Anna, because in some senses, if you're using workflows and you have a actual description of the workflow, so you can imagine the workflows in a workflow language, which is a descriptive language, which you're then executing by the engine, you can imagine that description is data. So you can treat it like data. But on the other hand, workflows are actually living objects. They're software, and they're dynamic. They have to actually be, you have to run them and test them, and they're constantly versioned and living, and they have dependencies, as Peter just pointed out. They have dependencies. So so in that sense, they're not the same as data. And also, if we're working completely in FAIR workflows, and I know you work in FAIR data, these workflows are also objects that can themselves make FAIR data. So they're almost like FAIR data engines as well. So they kind of have three aspects to them from the point of view of data. You can treat them like data, but you also treat them like software, and they can also be FAIR data instruments in their own right. And that's the three different levels that we're working on in the workflow community initiative around FAIR computational workflows, because you can apply FAIR data principles to the description, the declarative aspects, but but you have to apply fair software principles to the actual execution. And then what are the principles around them as instruments of fair? Well, that's interesting because what does that really mean? So folks do deposit them in data repositories. And actually, when we package up our workflows into these RO crates, which I know you know about, you could then deposit them as objects into Zenodo or Dataverse or another repository, because we have to operate in that kind of ecosystem. And in our environment here, you see at the bottom, we've got Zenodo. Well, that could, in the US environment, that would be Dataverse or maybe OSF or one of these others. Yeah, or the GREI now, aren't they? That's what it's called in the NIH, which is the generic, the generic research, something initiative. Tom, can you help me here on NIH?
The generalist repositories.
That's it. So I can't remember what the GREI stands for, but it's the generalist repositories, right? So that's where the generalist repositories are. But there you're just basically filing them. Yeah, they're just filed. And you're kind of putting them in a cupboard and admiring them. You can't actually then execute them.
Yeah, that is a problem. And then I mean I completely agree when you say that this is a kind of a special type of software, and it is a living thing. It is changing. It needs to be like tested, executed every once in a while, see if it works still. So maybe the next question would be, so you say how you implement this, like execution and testing. Do you do kind of like some sort of like a dry run for this workflow?
We have an entire platform called Life Monitor that does that. So in the bottom of this slide, there's a logo which has got Life Monitor, and there's also something called the Open Bench, which also does benchmarking of workflows. And I can send you an entire presentation about the Life Monitor. It's developed, which links up to a whole bunch of testing frameworks in order to be able to test the workflows. It uses again these research objects, so it takes the research objects of the workflow out of the hub, and it uses the information there in order to be able to have testing objects, which it then runs on various different platforms depending upon the workflow management system.
Yeah, I think that the folks at Harvard Data Commons would be really, really happy to see those slides. And does that mean that when you have like the Life Monitor, does that mean that you also have like some data workflow engines that are considered to be primary? In a sense, for example, maybe you're supporting common workflow language as a primary.
Yeah. So
maybe
are all the workflow engines equal, is what I guess you're saying? And the answer is no, they're not, because we have some workflow engines are more equal than others. Yes. So we have we do a lot of support for things like SnakeMake, Galaxy, increasingly Nextflow, CWL, and then but things like Skypian, we register them, but they're a bit more, you probably never even heard of Skypian. It's a workflow system that's used by structural bioinformatics, and it's very based around their kind of systems. So I think we have varying degrees of support for different workflow management systems, and as ones become more emergent and important, then we increase our support for them. And we see, particularly in biosciences, I would say, and Hervé can correct me if I'm wrong, that things like Galaxy and SnakeMake and Nextflow are very strong. Yeah, they're the really core ones. You don't see many people using Pegasus.
No.
Or, that's used in other domains.
But you still get lots of bash scripts, of course.
You get a ton of bash scripts and Python and all sorts of, and we just take them as we can, right? We take those and we register them, and you can go look at them. But Are we doing very elaborate support of testing them? No, we're not, right?
Okay, sounds fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. I will let other people ask questions.
Joy?
Thanks for the really interesting talk, Carole. So I run a repository that's focused on physics-based simulation of biological structures. We're very rudimentary compared to where other like genomics is in terms of the whole sharing. But we've started to think a little bit about workflow and this idea of capturing workflows beyond just sharing the data and the software. And so this is really interesting to us to think about, we're starting out, what are the things we should be building in? So 2 questions for you. One is, we don't want to build things from scratch. I'm wondering, is there a list? You said there were like 300 workflow management systems. Is there a place I could go just to see like what's already out there?
And Hervé is now putting it in the chat. It's the Common Workflow Language maintains a list of workflow management systems. Now, the tricky thing here, Joy, is there's 300 odd of them, right? So, okay, here it is. Now, you now got to sift out the wheat from the chaff, right? Because it just lists them. And now you've got to figure out which ones are sustained, which ones are used by everybody else, which one, what's their execution model, what's their data types that they take. KNIME, for example, is one that's both open source and commercial. It uses tables as its main data type, which is great if you're doing a lot of table processing. It's really, and it has whole libraries of workflows, particularly used in cheminformatics, pharmaceutical industry, and finance, right? Is it used extensively in geophysical or in astronomy or particle physics? No, it is not. So you have all different kinds of workflow systems. What you're asking for is something that the Workflow Community Initiative is looking to do. So this is a new group that's only just launched, and it's sponsored by Oakland Ridge, and they are bringing together workflow management systems in order to be able to answer this kind of question. And I'm doing fair computational workflows, but one of the things that I propose that we do as our first year work is say, what are the key features you need for different aspects of your workflow problem? And then what do each workflow management system, what does each workflow management system do in order to support that? So that you could then answer exactly your question, Joy, which is, I've got this kind of data and this kind of compute problem. What kind of workflow system should I really be looking at to cut down the 300 down to the 3 that you need to know? Now that's going to take quite some work, right, to do. And people have failed to do it in the past very well because they've typically gone to the workflow management systems to ask them that. They're the worst people to ask because they'll say, we can do everything. What you need is to ask the users of the systems to say, what can they really do? And so I think that's going to be, that's kind of a big challenge mission to that community. So it's not there yet, Joy, but you might want to join the community there if you're interested.
Sure, I'll follow up with you separately about.
Yeah. I'm sure that Hervé is now putting into the chat the link to the Workflows community web pages.
Oh, yeah, sure.
That's great. And then if we have time, I had a second question. Just in terms of the Workflow Hub, it sounds like obviously you're focused a lot on, you said like Galaxy and SnakeMate. I'm just wondering, and how much, flexibility is there for other, like if there is this new workflow that we develop, how would you go about making sure that it would be supported by Workflow Hub?
So we support workflow management systems and different and any kind. Well, we really don't care about the workflows themselves very much, to be honest. We're kind of, you know, we're the library. We didn't write the books. So what we're interested in is cataloging and telling you where to go. So what our metadata that we use in order to be able to describe the workflows is at the workflow level. It's not at the domain level. The only thing that we use that is domain specific is EDAM, which is an ontology for typing inputs and outputs. But in the schema that we use, you don't have to use EDAM. You could use another one. So if you had different kinds of, you know, if you're coming from the physics community, you'd use a physics ontology. The rest of it is just straightforwardly, it's just workflows. It's just describing the tools and it's describing your step, or it's describing the steps. I won't say tools, it's describing the steps. So that's very generic. And in fact, as I've already said, we've got biodiversity workflows in there, but we've also got climate change workflows in there. So climate modeling, various different simulation workflows are in there. Because really is not really bioscience specific, that apart from that EDAM ontology. And if you didn't use that, then there's nothing specific at all. So that might be interesting. Now, the question you're really asking is, if I pick a workflow management system and I want you to do native support for it and do a lot of the metadata lifting that we do for some of the others into it, well, then you join the WorkflowHub Club. And you say, look, this is what I need to do, and this is why I'm going to join in, and I'll come and help you do it, right? Because it's an open.
I see. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, just go to the about pages and join us.
Okay.
Okay.